Nova is absolutely awesome and can nuke away entire rooms of Steel Path enemies. However, not in the way that you might think now. So, in today's Warframe guide, I'm gonna show you this very easy and most importantly, super fun to play build right here, and of course also how you can make it happen for your own Nova. Big shout out to Warframe's quest to conquer cancer. Donate for the good cause via the link in the description in case you have a couple bucks to spare. And now, with that being said, let's jump right into it. Okay, before we jump into the skills right now, I got a little disclaimer to make, and that is, I am currently very busy in real life, and I'm not going to be in the office for the rest of the week. But I didn't want to let you wait another week for this Nova guide, so I decided instead of making a super long, detailed guide with multiple different builds that I was originally planning, I'm going to cut down on the editing a little bit for this one, and also just showcase this one very fun, quirky build. If you feel that after this video, you want to see more about Nova, a deeper dive into her skills, and also more variety builds for other scenarios, then leave me a comment down below so I can get back to it next week or the week after that. But with that being said, let's first take a look at Nova's skills. But alright, let's now get into Nova's skills, starting out as always with her passive, which is actually really cool since the rework. Because Nova, as we probably all know, can speed up or slow down enemies, enemies that are sped up have an increased chance to drop an energy orb on death, and slowed enemies have an increased chance of dropping a health orb. This, all in all, is a great passive for your energy economy, and depending on the build, this might already be all you really need. Nova's first is called Null Star, and in today's build we're mainly going to use this for our survivability. Now, Null Star surrounds Nova with a cloud of particles. The number of particles, you can see it in the bottom right corner of the screen, and each and every particle gives her a certain percentage of damage reduction, capping out at a maximum of 90%. This is very nice, but the problem is that if you get close to an enemy, these Null Stars are going to shoot out to damage the enemies, and you cannot avoid that, meaning your survivability is sort of ticking down over time when you're close to enemies. This sounds a bit bad, but don't worry, we're gonna fix that in the build. This skill can be used to deal damage, and you can build your Nova to make this skill deal damage. There's also an augment that helps with that, but for the sake of simplicity, we're not gonna go into that today because that's not what today's build is meant to do. As I said in the intro, if you want to learn more details about Nova, put it in the comments down below and I'll be able to get back to that in the near future. Ability number 2, Antimatter Drop. This is a very nice ability, but unfortunately we're also not going to use it today, so I'm going to keep it short on this. You create a sphere, you can shoot into that sphere, the sphere is then going to absorb the damage, and then you can shoot that sphere out towards the enemy to deal massive AoE damage. This all in all has great AoE potential and is viable as a skill. It also has an augment about which I don't want to talk in detail because guess what, we're not going to use it today, but you could certainly create a build around that. Skill number 3, Wormhole. You create a little portal, a wormhole with which you can teleport yourself over the battlefield. You can go through it, allies can go through it, you can even shoot through it, and in general, most people use it either to annoy their teammates or as a means of traversing the level faster. But there are also some niche cases, like for example in the Plains of Eidolon with that bounty where you need to escort the drone. At the end of the day, not a bad skill, but a very niche one, and for most setups, this would probably be the one which you want to replace with something else from the helmet if you choose to go for one. Oh yeah, Portal also has an augment that gives you a bit more movement speed after you exit it. I think it's not really worth the mod slot, but you do you. And finally, Nova's bread and butter would be called Molecular Prime. This is her big ultimate ability, and that's also the one that can either speed up or slow down enemies. When you cast this skill, you create an AoE aura that expands over time. Enemies that get into the aura will either be slowed down or sped up. If you tap the ability, they're going to be slowed. If you hold the ability, they're going to be sped up. And what's more is, every enemy hit by this aura will have a 200% damage vulnerability, making it so that you deal more damage to them. This vulnerability applies to overguard, shields, and health alike. Now, if you take out an enemy that is primed by Molecular Prime, then that enemy will explode, dealing a bit of AoE damage, and this AoE damage explosion also has the chance of triggering a blast status effect. I think most people will use Molecular Prime as a great crowd control to either slow down incoming hordes of enemies or speed them up to, fast forward a defense mission or something. But if you wanted to, you could also go for a setup that amplifies the damage of the explosions to create a chain reaction and room nuke with this ability. Molecular Prime also has an augment. This one though is really useful because what it does is, when an enemy under the influence of Molecular Prime dies, you get 2 of your Null stars back. You know, your first ability that gives you damage reduction but unfortunately shoots out this damage reduction over time. Well, this way you can constantly get it back and don't have to worry about it. Great augment overall. Oh, and by the way, what would also be great is if you could maybe spare a like for the video because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. And now, let's take a look at the build. And as always, when it comes to the builds, we are going to start out with the Archon shards, which in my opinion you don't really need, but I still want to cover them for 1 second. First off, I went for 2 yellows that give me more casting speed. This is especially great for her 4th ability because that takes some time to cast and this helps it speed up. If you have the Tau Forged to go for it, then you could also go for 2 Tau Forged. Then we go for 1 orange shard to refill shields whenever we kill an enemy with a blast damage. That is very nice because blast is what this whole build is going to be focused on. We're going to see that in a minute. And finally, I have 2 green Archon shards to allow me to get 14 corrosive status effects on every enemy, therefore fully stripping away their armor. Now, one important thing I want to mention here is, in reality, I would actually prefer going for 1 green Tau Forged instead of 2 green normals, because 1 Tau Forged gives you a 98% damage reduction, which is totally enough. You don't need to waste 2 slots just for those 2% more. I just went and used 2 for the showcase in this video, so you can actually see the enemy health bars turning red. I would actually recommend you go for 1 Tau Forged green, and then use the last slot for something of your liking. Next, as a helmet ability, I subsumed Roar, which I know is very boring and a lot of you don't like to see this, but I should say this whole build would also work totally fine without Roar, so if you have some other preferences, then feel free to absolutely go for it as much as you like. But now let's go on with the mods, where I don't want to start with Nova herself, but actually with the weapon that we use, and that would be the Falcor. The Falcor is a glaive, just like the Zor is, but the special thing about the Falcor is that it force procs electricity whenever it bounces between enemies. This is a very nice feat and we're gonna use this for the build. Now, unlike most glaive-type weapons, this is not meant to be thrown and then exploded, even though you can clearly see that this does a lot of damage. Instead, we want it to bounce between the enemies and thereby dealing corrosive and blast status effects with melee influence, which is then gonna spread those status effects to the entire crowd. So, let's take a look in detail on how exactly this is gonna work. This right here is the Falcor build, and in the arcane slot, to absolutely nobody's surprise, we have melee influence, which makes it that when we trigger a melee electricity effect, there is a chance that we get the melee influence buff, which then allows us to spread the status effects that we have modded onto the melee to enemies in a 20-meter AoE. Those status effects that we want to spread would be, as we also see here, blast and corrosive. Reason for that is A, corrosive to armor strip the enemies, so we deal much more damage to them, and blast because blast is just a generally great AoE tool to deal a lot of damage to bigger groups of enemies that are closely grouped up. In order to get blast, of course we mod cold and heat onto the weapon. Then to get corrosive, we only need to add toxin because by default, as you also see here, this weapon does have electricity damage, meaning that will combine with the toxin here to corrosive, leading to us having blast and corrosive. Now, you might think, if you only have blast and corrosive, then how are you going to trigger melee influence because this needs an electricity proc? This is easily explained because, as I initially said, it force procs electricity, as you also see here, whenever it bounces between enemies. Therefore, triggering melee influence, as you see here, is no problem even if there is no electricity itself on the weapon. So much for the elements. It's also very important that we go for the 60-60 ones here because we want as much status chance as humanly possible. In the stance mod, it doesn't matter, go for whatever you like. Then Prime Pressure Point for more base damage. Then a Prime Faction mod because Prime Faction mods are very important for damage over time builds. Melee Elementalist, which further amplifies the damage from our blast procs, and also it helps us to give us more heavy attack wind-up speed. That is certainly nice. If you wanted to, you could replace this with Galvanized Elementalist. This has a bit less status chance, therefore it gives you even more status chance and stacks over time. This theoretically is better from the effect than Melee Elementalist normally here, But in practice, I found it was a bit of a nuisance because that slower wind-up speed, like, you really feel that. Then, next, we go for Volatile Rebound. The great thing about Volatile Rebound is that when the glaive bounces, it creates an explosion, therefore it gives us a bit of AoE without us having to explode the whole thing. As you also see right here, if we throw it down on the floor, we have this AoE explosion. Therefore, one glaive throw can hit multiple enemies at the same time. This is very useful. And finally, we go for Weeping Wounds. This gives us massively more status chance the higher our combo multiplier gets, and this is no problem for the build because instead of our usual glaive playstyle where we just explode the stuff mid-air, for this build, we're just throwing the glaive and let it bounce, therefore our combo multiplier stays high and increases even further, therefore giving us maximum status chance with Weeping Wounds. As you also see right here in this final showcase, as soon as melee influence triggers, you're going to have the corrosive, you're going to have the blast all over the place, making the enemies more vulnerable because it takes their armor away, and at the same time dealing massive blast damage against them. You can also try to pull that off again, throw the glaive in, and kaboom. You saw before they all exploded, the one health bar there got red for a split second. That's what I meant. Because of the spread through melee influence, we're going to have all the corrosive, all the blast on all the enemies around us constantly. But so much for the Falcor, let's now look at the Nova build. Here, in the aura, I went for Swift Momentum. This is an odd choice, but it gives us more heavy attack wind-up speed, which is actually quite important because the only other mod that gives us wind-up speed would be Melee Elementalist, and you really want to have at least 2 sources of wind-up speed, therefore this is a nice aura, but if you don't care so much about it, you could go for whatever you like here. In the Excellent slot, I went for Primed Sure-Footed because when you play with explosive glaives, we all know it, we can easily knock ourselves back and forth all the time, and I wanted to avoid that. Arcane Fury to give ourselves even more melee damage. And then for the stats, I went for a healthy mix of range, duration, and strength, though I have a bit more strength here because it increases the damage bonus that we get from Roar. If you don't use a helmet that wants strength, you could totally get away with less strength here, and therefore I would go for more duration, because duration is, funnily, what increases the radius of Molecular Prime or 4th ability. Then we also went for a bit of range because the explosion radius of when an enemy dies from this is affected by the range. Right now we have 14.5 meters, which is very nice. Equilibrium for the energy economy, but depending on the build, you might not even need this. To stay alive, of course, we're going to use the damage reduction from her 1 plus adaptation, which is a second layer of damage reduction. This way, we can shield tank with primed redirection, but you could also go normal redirection, it's no problem. Prime continuity, blind, rage, stretch, and intensify, as I just said, for the healthy mix of duration, range, and strength. And finally, Molecular Fission, the augment for her 4 that I previously mentioned, where whenever we kill an enemy that is under the effect of this, we get 2 Null Star particles back, therefore keeping our damage reduction at the maximum pretty much all the time, and we don't have to worry about it. Now, all in all, this build right here, it's not quote-unquote meta, it's not totally min-maxed, you could certainly criticize a lot about it, but because of the fact that so many other great creators have already talked about Nova, I just wanted to do something a bit odd, a bit creative that is totally fun to play, so how about we actually take a look now at how this performs in mission. Oh yeah, by the way, and for a companion, you can totally go for whatever you like. I went for Diriga with Verglass Prime, this right here is the Diriga build. This right here is the Verglass build. You, as I said, go for whatever you like. I just copy-pasted this one from my Diriga build that I posted a couple weeks ago. Okay, so let's go into a Grineer mission in the Kuva Fortress. First of all, we activate our Null Stars for the damage reduction. We now use our 4th ability in the speed mode so that the enemies get closer to us, and then we start throwing the glaive, and you see, as you see in the corridor right there, right, as soon as melee influence triggers, we have the chain reaction, the explosions going absolutely crazy, the glaive bouncing between the enemies, every glaive hit inflicting melee influence, every melee influence thereby spreading blast and spreading corrosive, armor stripping and blasting the enemies away at the same time, and we don't even need critical hits to deal a lot of damage. This is super amazing. And this pretty much already wraps up how this build is played. Because of the augment for your 4, you don't really have to worry about your Null Stars. They're going to be recharged all the time. You can also see it in the bottom right corner. You just recast your Molecular Prime from time to time. If you wanted to, you could go for the Roar to even amp up the damage more if that is what you need. And then you do throw the glaive into the mix and that's it. You can do that. You can get crazy kills per minute out of this. And it's just super easy and fun to play. Also, the Falcor is not an expensive weapon, everybody can easily get it. And, you know, all in all, it's just a little bit more creative, a little bit less standard quote-unquote meta stuff. I just like this build, I wanted to showcase it to you. As I said in the intro of the video, if you want to see more quote-unquote meta builds for also other situations, like a slowing defense build or something in that direction, put it in the comments down below and I hope I'd be able to get to it soon. But Nova is not the only frame who got a fat rework. Also, Caliban looks better than ever now. So don't miss my super buff Caliban guy right here. Another big shout out also to Quest to Conquer Cancer, link in the description. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.